Hi, these are Lance's Legends. Hit the subscribe button in the bottom right corner. I hope you enjoyed this story. By 1981, I had climbed Lone Peak hundreds of times. I loved that mountain. It was my sanctuary. I particularly enjoyed trying to climb it on New Year's Day. The conditions had to be just right, or it was a pretty difficult trip. But I've successfully been up there several times to bring in the new year. This particular year, I had two friends that decided they wanted to join in on the adventure with me. One is my good friend Doug Porter. He was an experienced guy in the mountains, didn't have all the best equipment, but he was a strong hiker and a clear thinker. The other one was making a last-ditch effort in his life. He was going to turn 40 that year, and he saw me as an opportunity of adventures. So I took Pat on quite a few trips with me. He proved to be a real anchor on this one. They got to the trailhead, and their packs looked like a couple of Bedouin desert people. I mean, they had stuff tied all over. Doug was dating a beautiful girl, Brenda Sanford, and she agreed to take us to the trailhead and drop us off. We got all our gear out, started putting on our snowshoes and our packs, and we got Pat ready. He had the stupidest ski poles I've ever seen. Pat was vertically challenged. He was only 5'5", but he had ski poles that were way too short for him. They were probably made for a 5-year-old, and they barely made it up past his knees. We questioned why he would bring those poles, and he assured us that because of his short legs and the deep snow, that those poles would help him stay upright, which did not prove to be the case. We started up the trail, and Doug and I took turns leading in the snow. We'd been hiking about 15 minutes, and we decided we'd better stop because we hadn't seen or heard Pat for a while. We waited, and we waited. And after about 10 minutes, we got a little worried. We thought, well, we've only been hiking 15 minutes. We've waited 10. We better go back and see what's going on. So we hiked back a while and found Pat floundering like a turtle on his back with these stupid little short ski poles. And he had fallen to the side, still had his snowshoes on, still had his pack strapped to his shoulders and his back. And we helped him and got him back on the trail, dusted him off, patted him on the butt like a little kid, and tried to encourage him to hike a little faster. We tried to encourage Pat just to turn around and walk back to the valley because he obviously was not cut out for the trip. But he assured us that he could do it, and he, I think, was afraid of hiking back alone because he couldn't seem to get up if he fell down, and he seemed to fall down quite regularly. We were determined to make it to Second Hamongog. I had thought it'd take 2, maybe 3 hours, but it was well over 5 hours before we got there. And we had to go back and rescue Pat over and over again. I was getting frustrated with him. He kept explaining to us that his legs weren't as long as ours and that he couldn't walk as fast as we could and that he had every excuse in the book. Well, we listened to him and we kept trying to encourage him, but there was a storm closing in on us, and the prefrontal winds got more intense the higher we got on the mountain. And by the time we got to the 8,000 foot mark at Second Hamongog, they were gusting well over 60 miles an hour. The tall trees didn't do much to stop the wind. And we could feel the storm was impending and just closing in on us. The day was getting done, and by the time we got there, we decided we'd probably better drop down out of the wind into Fort Canyon. Fort Canyon is a waterform canyon that goes west out of Second Hamongog, and runs between the main granite mountain and the glaciated debris that form the foothills for that part of the mountain. And I'd never been in the canyon, but it's a beautiful canyon. And we dropped down a couple of 100 yards until we felt we were out of the wind, and we found a nice flat spot, and we set up camp. Then we broke some pine boughs out of some nearby trees and found a bunch of tinder and started a big fire. In the winter, when you build a fire on snow, it just slowly sinks into the snow, and the snow was 5 or 6 feet deep, so it just kept dropping a little lower. Around 9 o'clock, I slipped back into the tent and pulled out a surprise. I had carried a big glass bottle of Martinelli's sparkling apple juice, and we uncorked it and passed it around and toasted in the new year. The ferocious wind suddenly turned and came out of the north, and it was a cold, cold wind. In the middle of the winter, in the middle of the night, in the Utah mountains, this north wind, and I knew that was a sign that the storm was on us. So we climbed in the tent and settled in. I lit up my Svea stove in there, but I felt like it was pulling the oxygen out of the tent, so we just climbed in our bags and we were sound asleep by New Year's. In the middle of the night, I could feel the tent was being crushed in from all sides, and the storm was so ferocious, and down in that canyon we were also exposed to drifting wind coming down off the ridge, and our tent was getting buried. So I got on what gear I had to, and I went out and shoveled the snow from around the tent and off the top. We woke up the next morning, and the snow was burying the tent on the side. So Doug and I went out, got the snowshoes, and we dug all around the tent and kicked all the snow off the top. But it was still just a blizzard, the strong north wind. So we climbed back in the tent, got out of the wind, and fired up the stove, made a hot breakfast, and thought we'd wait till the storm cleared. And we waited, and we waited. We'd mark in the frost on the side of the tent the snow level, and then we'd time it. And we were getting several inches of snow an hour. So every once in a while, we'd have to go out and clean the snow off the tent. Other times, nature called, and we had to go outside. But other than that, there were 2.5 men trapped in a tent made for 2 people all day long. My patience had run pretty slim with Pat. I was sick of all his excuses and bravado because he had no room for any boasting. He seemed to feel a little superior to Doug and I. Doug just had a BYU diploma, and I'd only been to high school, and he had a Harvard MBA. But after dragging his carcass up that mountain all the day before, I wasn't in much of a mood to listen to it. And Doug reminds me that I closed in the top of his bag and pummeled him a few times trying to shut him up. But we were getting a little cabin fever and a little stir crazy as the day wore on. And the snow just kept coming and coming and coming. We thought, we can't hike out when it's like this. And finally, about 2:30, 3 o'clock in the afternoon, it began to show signs of letting up. We discussed what we were going to do. I still wanted to go for the summit. But Pat was convinced that he had had enough, and that if you were smart, you'd just go down. And I told him if we were going to turn around, I wanted to go down Fort Canyon. I'd never been in the canyon. And from what I could see, it was a beautiful canyon. So we negotiated a settlement. We wouldn't go to the top. We would turn around and just go down the canyon. So we hurried and broke down the tent and all the gear and stowed everything and started off. We had about 2 hours of daylight left. We felt like that should be plenty. And we started. And once again, Pat was the same as he was the day before. Every few hundred yards, he would fall. And there were a lot of obstacles in this canyon. There was avalanche debris, and there are dozens of cliff lines and rock formations to negotiate around. And there's a fair-sized stream that goes down the canyon. And since it's a water-formed canyon, it's a V shape. And before long, we were committed into the canyon. So we hiked, pulled Pat out of snowbanks, and he had lagged behind. And finally, I went back, and he was floundering again like a turtle with these stupid little tiny ski poles. And by then, my patience was gone, and I grabbed those ski poles and just threw them up into the hill. And they just disappeared into the fresh new snow. Pat and Doug just looked. They didn't say a word. We got Pat back up and we started. The stream, every once in a while, would be exposed as it went over rocks or over a waterfall. We came to a formation late in the day, and it was a big rolling granite face, and there was a big ice shield, and then from underneath the ice came this roaring stream, and then it cascaded off a 25-foot cliff into a pool of water. So I put on my crampons and hiked across the ice and dropped my pack, then came back, and Doug didn't have crampons, so I gave him my ice axe, and he and I were definitely the heaviest combo, and so I helped him across the ice, and he got to the other side. I took the ice axe back and went to get Pat, started across the ice, and the ice collapsed. Pat had his pack on, and we plunged off of this 25-foot cliff into this pool of ice cold, churning water. It was about 10 feet deep. We both went in over our heads, came out sputtering, and I grabbed Pat and pulled him out. And Doug must have just been horrified, but he grabbed my pack and he made his way down the far side of the stream. And there was a little island in the middle of the stream next to the pool, and it looked like a mushroom. It had about 3 feet of snow on it and then stream on both sides. And we set up my tent and we packed it down because Pat was going into hypothermia and we had to act fast. Looking back, we probably should have hiked a little further and found a place where we could set up camp and make a fire, but we were in a desperate emergency situation where we had to keep Pat from freezing. And he was completely wet, head to toe, and so was I. But unlike Pat, I had dry gear in my pack. So we hurried and set up the tent, and it was cold. The wind was just howling, coming straight down off Lone Peak. And it was cold. We got the tent set up as fast as we could, and Pat had gone into just complete uncontrolled shaking. And I realized he was going into hypothermic shock. So I got my sleeping bag out and I told Doug he was going to have to volunteer the hollow filled bag that he'd bought from old man Miller at Miller Ski Company and put it over the top of us because we had to warm Pat up as fast as we could. We fired up the Svea stove and then I climbed into the little tapered bag with Pat. So the two of us were wedged in there, and I have a high metabolism, and we'd been pushing for several hours, so I was a hot body at that point, and I helped revive him. We made dinner and stuffed as much warm food down him as we could, and then I drew the short straw. I had to spend the night just wedged in this little bag with Pat. By morning, he seemed to be okay. The problem was his clothes were all frozen solid standing in the corner of the tent. And he didn't have any extra gear. His sleeping bag was sopping wet. All of his gear was completely saturated. Doug and I donated everything we could, dry socks, dry shirt, but he had to put on a frozen coat and frozen snow pants to keep the wind off of him. We had a warm breakfast and we started on our way thinking that within a few hours we'd be out. And we just kept trudging along, and Pat kept falling down and whining and complaining, and we just tried to keep him moving. And about midday came to a spot where there was about a 40-foot cliff, and it didn't seem like there was a decent way around it on either side of the stream. I always carried a half-inch, 60-foot nylon rope. Wasn't as strong or as heavy as a regular climbing rope, but in mountaineering assist, it was really functional. And I had that with me, so I convinced Doug and Pat that I could lower them off this cliff. And it was a 90-degree edge. We sent Pat off as a test dummy. They had the rope go around my back through both my hands, and I sent him down off the cliff, and he got down and unhooked the rope and sent it back up. And then Doug and I began to argue about whether or not I could support him as he went off this cliff. And I assured him that if I leveraged myself right, that I could do it. It wasn't a matter of strength, but leverage. And he wasn't buying it, but I finally convinced him to trust me. And he put the rope around him as he questioningly looked at me and backed off the cliff right as he put his full committed weight off the back of this cliff. I came forward, and I had to let go of the rope and just let it slip through my hands, and it actually burned a hole in my coat on the wrist where the rope went over my wrist and through my hand. So Doug kind of free fell most of the way down. I think I put a little pressure on at the end. I assure him I did, but he survived. He landed in the snow and undid the rope, cussed at me a little bit. And then I had to work my way down this snowy, icy cliff line, which took a while. By the time I got down there, Pat had again gone into hypothermic shock. He became hysterical. He started to swear and curse and call us to the dogs. He was not himself. It's like he was possessed. It was hard not to laugh. This little short guy spouting off the way he was, but he was just in a state of desperation. His lips had turned blue, his eyes were blue, his face was white. He was shaking all over, and he was cursing like a sailor. And so we decided that we were in a critical situation, and that the only choice we had was to once again get down into a sleeping bag with Pat, try to get him warmed back up, and send Doug down for help. We didn't know if that would come by way of helicopter or what. So we hurried and broke out Doug's extra hollow fill bag and put my bag inside Doug's, and then stripped all the frozen clothes off Pat and stuffed him in. Then I wedged myself down in there with him, and we'd been working hard for several hours. So I was putting out a lot of heat, and then Doug took off. Within about 15 minutes, Pat was feeling like this is not the place to be. It's going to take hours and hours for Doug to get help and for them to get up to us. And how will they find us? And how will they get us off the mountain? It'll take all night. And all of a sudden, Pat decided he had the energy and the wherewithal. We were going to hike off this mountain. So I told him, look, I've got to track Doug down. So I ran up about 100 yards ahead, and I yelled down to Doug, and he had made his way down 2 or 3 other cliff lines and obstacles and was going through a big, tall stand of pines. And he heard me. I told him, we're coming. Just wait there for us. And when we got down to Doug, I don't know, a half hour later, Doug was nearly frozen himself because he'd been basically sitting in the snow in this very cold day, just sitting there waiting for us to catch up. And we had his main sleeping bag. So we stowed his sleeping bag back with his gear and moved on our way. And it just seemed like this canyon just kept going and going and going. We could see the valley down below us, and yet it seemed like it wasn't that much closer. We kept thinking that around this next turn and down off this next cliff, we'll be able to see our way out of here. And then we'd get to that point, and it looked like it did 300, 400 yards back. And it just, but Pat was whining the whole time. He had really gotten to the point of desperation. I kept assuring him that it couldn't be far to the valley. We just had to keep going. And it was getting later in the day, and we'd been trapped in this steep-sided canyon for the whole day. And our mindset had just accepted that fact. But as the day began to draw to a close, we decided we needed to involve the Lord in our situation. All three of us were returned missionaries for the LDS Church. So we decided we would ask the Lord for an assist. And I knelt down first and petitioned the Lord and asked him if we couldn't get out of the canyon today to please bless us so we could be warm tonight, but that we'd prefer to get out of the canyon. And then Doug basically said a similar prayer that we really wanted to get out today, but if we had to spend the night, help us survive the night. And I'll never forget Pat's prayer. I've never heard anybody plead with the Lord like that. He dropped to his knees. He was like, please, God, please, God, please, God, we can't spend another night in the canyon. Please, God, help us get out of the canyon now. And he was desperate. There was no doubt in his mind that we could not spend another night in the canyon. And after we prayed, I looked around and I thought, I think I could probably climb through this deep snowfall because the sides of the canyon had just relaxed a little bit. And the canyon side south of us was covered with scrub oak. And some of that scrub oak was just poking through a little bit in the deep snow. So I started to climb and use those branches of that scrub oak and pull myself until I'd gone the length of the rope. And then I tossed the rope down to Doug and Pat. And after about 4 or 5 pitches of that rope, we topped the crest of the ridge. And we were only maybe a half a mile away from Grove Drive in Alpine. And it was getting the end of daylight for sure. And we hoofed it as fast as we could. We went straight down off the side of this hill and climbed over a fence, and we made it to pavement. And just about the time we got there, it was dark. So we started walking down the road towards Alpine. And after about 20 minutes or so, we could see the headlights from an approaching vehicle. And it was an old Jeep Wagoneer, had a father and a daughter in it. And Doug and I stepped to the side of the road. We were going to hail him down, but Pat dropped right where he was, right in the middle of the road, and he laid down and put his arms out, and he was not going to let this vehicle go by. He was taking no chance of them not stopping. He got them to stop, and we climbed in the back, threw our packs in the very back of the Wagoneer, and they drove us into Alpine. And Pat was just beside himself. He was so cold and so desperate. They dropped us off at the grocery store. It was the only store in Alpine at the time, and there was a payphone on the outside. We called Brenda again to come pick us up. And we waited in the store until she got there. At that point, I told Pat that after dragging his butt up that mountain and down, and we'd gotten him safely back to civilization, that he owed Doug and I a steak dinner. There was a restaurant back then in Lehigh called Porter's Place. It was named after Porter Rockwell, and they were famous for huge, steaks. And the 4 of us climbed into a booth at Porter's Place, and we had a steak dinner. I hope you've enjoyed this story. The experience I had that winter made me decide that I needed to go up Fort Canyon the next spring. So the next part of this video will be me talking about the trip up Fort Canyon in the spring. I hope you enjoyed that story. These are Lance's Legends. Hit the subscribe button in the bottom right corner. Thanks for listening.